Chapter 6. Holt heard them leave just before 3 in the morning. They were thieves, and they were accustomed to moving quietly. But the ranger's senses were finely tuned, and he was a light sleeper. He listened to their stealthy movements and quiet footsteps as they gathered their kit together and stole out into the night. The moon had waxed and waned hours ago, and there was a scattered cloud cover riding on the wind, sending bands of shadows scudding across the silent camp. Cord and Gerald had no trouble eluding the sentries. The men on watch were tired and bored as they neared the end of their 3-hour watch. And besides, they were more inclined to look for intruders from outside the camp than people leaving from inside. The rumor that the company would be heading south and continuing the campaign was a false one Holt had concocted to force the thieves' hand, so with the company due to return home and disband in the near future, there was little reason for men to desert. He waited 15 minutes to give the two time to clear the camp perimeter, then rolled out of his blankets and ghosted out of the tent after them. He retrieved his own clothes from the company command tent. Griff was waiting for him, a shaded lantern throwing a dim light over the interior. "They took the bait?" he asked. Holt nodded. He changed clothes and placed the heavy purse containing his winnings on the table. "You can put this into the company fund," he said. He knew most companies contributed to a fund that was used to help the families of those who lost their lives on campaign. Griff nodded his thanks. "If you catch them, feel free to bring them back here," he said. "I'll be quite happy to see to their future discomfort." "Oh, I'll catch 'em all right," Holt told him. "And when I do, it'll be up to them how I deal with them." He shook hands with the sergeant major and went to the rear of the tent, where Abelard was waiting. He swung up into the saddle and trotted out of the camp. He made no attempt at concealment, identifying himself to the sentries as he went. He found the north road and held Abelard down to a walk. He didn't want to catch up to the two men too quickly. Concealed in his ranger cloak, they might not recognize him as their erstwhile tent mate, but the sight of a ranger traveling the same road might panic them into abandoning their plans for the time being. As dawn came and the first grey light stole over the countryside, he increased his pace. Before long, he rounded a bend and caught sight of two figures trudging along the high road, several hundred meters in front of him. Thankfully, the headache and blurred vision that had plagued him were gone, and he had no trouble recognizing the two men. Cord, tall and wiry, Gerald, more compact and solidly built. He checked Abelard and moved off the road, where the dark green of the trees would conceal them from view. When Cord and Gerald rounded another bend and disappeared from sight, he cantered slowly after them. He proceeded in that fashion for the rest of the day. As the light improved, he was able to make out their tracks on the dusty road. Their hobnailed army sandals left an easily followed trail. He fell further back, only closing up again when the light began to fail in the late afternoon. As dusk was falling, the two men moved off the highway and made camp. Holt spent the night wrapped in his cloak, leaning against a tree and watching the light of their fire. He dozed in brief snatches, confident that Abelard would wake him if there were any movement from the distant camp. He woke cold and cramped in the early morning light. The fire had died before dawn, and there was a thin spiral of smoke rising from it. After half an hour, he saw the two men rising and moving around their campsite. Abelard was back in the trees, and there was no need for Holt to seek concealment. Wrapped in his cloak, he would be invisible, even if they looked directly at him. His stomach grumbled as they relit their fire, and he smelt bacon frying. After that, the smell of coffee brewing made his mouth water. He contented himself with a discreet mouthful of cold water from his canteen. It was a poor substitute. The pair were slow in getting moving. Holt shifted uncomfortably a few times, waiting for them to get on the road. Finally, they rolled their packs and struck camp, heading north once more. He waited until they had rounded the next bend in the road, then moved to where Abelard waited inside the trees. He tightened the girth straps. He had left his horse saddled through the night in case of an emergency, mounted, and rode slowly after them. When he reached the bend, he dismounted and went ahead to peer around down the next stretch of road. There was no sign of them. For a moment, his heart raced with panic. This stretch of road was at least 300 meters long, and there was no way they could have reached the far end before he rounded the bend. Where had they gone? Had they become aware that they were being followed? Perhaps they'd gone to ground somewhere along the road and were now waiting in ambush for whoever was behind them. Or had they moved more quickly than he had judged and were now beyond the far bend? He forced himself to calm down. Both those theories were possibilities, he admitted, but it was more likely that they had moved off the high road onto a side track somewhere along the way. They were inside Aspienne Fife now, and they could be close to Daniel's farm. He remounted Abelard and tapped his heels into the horse's side. The temptation was to gallop full out to see if there was in fact a turn-off, but doing so would cause noise and would risk drawing their attention. He trotted the little horse gently along the hard surface of the high road. 40 meters along, he found what he was looking for. A narrow side trail led off from the main road. It was well travelled and seemed to have been established for some time. He glanced along it, but it wound and twisted through the trees, and there was no sign of Cord and Gerald. But as he studied the ground, he saw a familiar footprint. Cord's right boot was worn down on the inside, the result of an uneven stance. There, in the sand that formed the path's surface, he could see the distinctive print. He swung down from the saddle and led Abelard along the track. It wouldn't do to come upon them unexpectedly. Presently, he began to smell wood smoke, then the rich and distinctive odour of a farmyard. It was a mixture of manure, fresh-cut hay, and large animals that told him he was nearing Daniel's farm. Then he heard a sound that confirmed the fact. Somewhere close to hand, a woman screamed.